Welcome to Control and the Law. I'm Sarah Ellis, barrister. And in this episode, I discuss post-separation abuse with Dr. Kathryn Spearman from Pennsylvania State University. Kathryn qualified as a paediatric nurse, and it was her first-hand experiences of witnessing children being refused essential medical interventions by controlling parents that ignited her interest in post-separation abuse, its impact on children's health, and how systems change can assist in protecting children. In this episode, we discuss how post-separation abuse is vested in coercive controlling patterns, the concept of custody stalking, how professionals can spot post-separation abuse behaviours, and the impact post-separation abuse and domestic abuse has on children's health. I start this episode by asking Kathryn to define what post-separation abuse is.
It's domestic violence or intimate partner violence that continues after separation. And it's a pattern, it's really closely aligned with coercive control or intimate terrorism. And it's an ongoing pattern of intimidation and harassment. And it includes a wide range of tactics. Those tactics can change. It can be isolation. It can be legal abuse. It could be economic abuse. Stalking is a really big one that we see in the post-separation. And then when physical proximity is limited between the adult partners, they often still have access to their children. And so then children are weaponized. Children are then a vehicle to control and continue to perpetrate abuse and cause distress for survivors.
Because the relationship has come to an end, frequently the controlling person doesn't have the same access to the victim. They certainly don't have the same influence. And what we find is they start recruiting third parties, don't they? They use systems, they use processes, they use institutions, they might use friends or family. And the harm to the victim is they become, in effect, entrapped by a whole ecosystem, a whole range of different organizations, professionals, whatever it may be. And the entrapment can be incredibly harmful in those circumstances.
Exactly. And I think maybe it was my nursing background. As nurses, we look at the environments and the conditions in which people live from a really holistic perspective. And so I was feeling frustrated in that people were also often looking at sort of narrow, like, let's define economic abuse or let's define legal abuse or, physical violence. And there was a lack of really looking at all the different tactics that are used post-separation, and they're all really harmful.
Just in respect of your nursing background, so you qualified as a nurse and now are an assistant professor. What was it that you saw in your clinical life that led you on that journey?
Yeah, so I started my career as a pediatric nurse. So I worked on an infant and toddler unit, and really kind of what started the research question that I had was seeing how caregivers, particularly non-offending caregivers, were really constrained by systems. A classic example I give is the child who's hospitalized with an asthma exacerbation because their co-parent refused to give them an inhaler. And then non-offending parents were also held sort of mutually responsible for their child's difficulties, when in fact it was really being driven by one parent who had the legal rights and then could withhold treatments. And so I was just really curious, how does this overarching legal environment influence children's health outcomes? And that was the big question, particularly in the context of violence. And the more I started talking to survivors and asking questions, I realized there was just a massive gap in sort of research and practice and understanding the problem. And I was feeling really frustrated at all the kids who I felt like were harmed by legal systems that didn't understand the context of their life. And I wanted to do something about it.
Do you think one of the key issues is that legal systems and as legal professionals, we're not abuse informed?
Definitely. Legal systems, there's still this sort of old school thought of like, well, there's going to be a black eye if there's abuse, and not understanding all the other ways that someone's agency and autonomy to protect and promote their child's health are really constrained. When I'm working at the bedside and taking care of a kid, I'm quite literally putting a Band-Aid on the problem that really needs a structural solution. And that structural solution is judges understanding how their decision-making impacts not just the immediacy of a child's safety, but their long-term health and well-being. And that being their physical health, their mental health, their behavioral health, their ability to achieve in school, and also their economic stability. I think that's a really important one too.
From your concept analysis, You talk about the prevalence of the issue, which I have to say I found absolutely shocking. And up to 90% of cases where a woman is fleeing an abusive partner, there will be post-separation abuse.
But even when the physical violence has stopped after separation or the sexual violence has stopped, we know that people who use violence will use these other forms. And so other studies have cited numbers as many as 90% of women report some form of continued harassment. There's some scholars out of Canada, Dr. Marilyn Ford Gilbo, and they've used the term intrusion, that there's this continued intrusion. And I think that word really fits what a lot of survivors describe. Particularly, and I think it's really important that we differentiate between survivors who share children in common with the person who's using violence versus someone who doesn't, right? That family entanglement complicates things because there's not a clean break. If you don't have children, you can leave the relationship and kind of not look back. But when children are shared in common, that's really when you've got laws around parenting rights and access and all of that, which really complicates things. And then you have also this general perception from providers. These folks need to figure out how to get along for the sake of their kids, and not understanding that there's abuse.
We're missing what the motivations of the controlling person are, because we see in child contact or care disputes, we see the parents as both sort of being equal and both wanting a relationship with the child and basically coming to court in good faith. And that's not what's happening in some cases. The motivations of controlling people are not about having that access to the child to build the relationship. It's having the access to control the victim.
Exactly. There's this ideal that parenting rights should really be preserved. In an ideal world, yes, every child is going to have two parents who love them and nurture them, and provide a safe environment. But that's an ideal world. That's not the world that we live in. And people really need to understand the sort of complexities and nuance of violence.
One of the points you make in the concept analysis is that professionals underestimate how dangerous post-separation abuse can be to children and to survivors.
I had the great privilege for my PhD training to work with Dr. Jackie Campbell, who created the danger assessment. And I was working with her on her study for intimate partner homicide. And for my dissertation, I wanted to look at the family courts really as a point of intervention because, when you think about meeting kids where they are, we know that kids who are presenting to the family court are vulnerable. And so I got really interested in this idea of how are family courts responding to domestic violence. And so what really struck me is I was having conversations with survivors who were navigating family court and they were sharing their stories with me. I was noticing they were telling me so many of the risk factors that I was reading about in this homicide study that I was working with Dr. Campbell. So we know what risk factors are for adult women who are experiencing domestic violence for homicide. Those are prior history and non-fatal strangulation, stalking, firearm access, separation is a big one. And these mothers that I was talking to in my dissertation, many of them had these same risk factors and the same pattern of behavior that I was reading in these homicide reports. And that to me was really scary. And one of the things about separation is that we know it's a risk factor for murdered women and children, but so many people experience breakups, right? And so how do you help people differentiate between a bad breakup, a sad breakup, and one that's going to have a potentially lethal outcome? And I think that piece is really understanding the control, because separation from a controlling perpetrator is really the danger factor. And so we have to find better ways to measure that and help professionals notice those red flags.
Yes, post-separation abuse is vested in coercive control. And you make the comparison with situational couple violence. So we're talking about different types of domestic abuse. So we've got the coercive control, which Michael Johnson described as intimate terrorism. Now, I know a lot of researchers don't necessarily like that terminology, and they say, well, it's not really intimate terrorism. But I think it's a really useful label for controlling people. If nothing else, then when professionals, I'm talking about social workers or court reporters, are looking at their recommendations in a report around child contact and access, if it's in their mind that one party is an intimate terrorist, then surely they have to question, how reasonable is it for me to expect the victim, the survivor, to engage with this individual, to try and negotiate childcare, to try and negotiate access schedules, staying over, all that sort of thing. When we know you just simply can't negotiate with terrorists. And although it sounds a bit extreme, I actually think it's a really, really useful terminology, because otherwise what we tend to do is think of these people as a toxic breakup, it's a bad relationship, it's mutually hostile. And it isn't. It's a controlling person and it's a survivor. And that controlling person simply wants to maintain the control and punish the victim for the relationship ending.
I really like the term intimate terrorism because I think it really describes the behaviors and what they're doing. Even though I like the terminology coercive control, the limitation is that do we always know that the intent is actually to control? Sometimes I think the perpetrator may already have control. The intent is to punish, like you said, it's to terrorize. With Johnson's typology, I think, unfortunately, the terminology of situational couple violence has really been misused in family court settings, and it kind of gives people an easy out. Well, they're both being problematic, instead of understanding if there's abuse, someone has power and someone doesn't. And I think people who use violence and who use coercion are really good at setting what I like to call provocation traps, right? They're really good at knowing how to push the buttons and get an emotional response out of the person that they're targeting and then using that against them. And so I think terrorism really describes that pattern of behavior, whereas control is maybe less descriptive. Terrorism is a good word because there's so many overlaps. And I think when survivors describe it, it feels like psychological torture.
I think it also speaks to the futility of trying to engage with the person and trying to cooperate and in any way compromise, because you just simply cannot compromise with this person because they're not interested in compromise and they're not interested in co-parenting. And I think perhaps at this point we could talk about the psychology of the controlling person and what's going on in their mind and what their objectives are, what their motivations are, because that's helpful for professionals to understand that. So post-separation, can you tell us what's happening at this point?
Sure. I think underlying it is really a sense of entitlement, right? People who do this feel that they are entitled to punish their partner for leaving them. They're entitled to make decisions, unilateral decisions for the whole family system, for the children, for their former partner. They're not operating in good faith. Survivors oftentimes, when they share their story, they may focus on kind of like the nitty-gritty of day-to-day, because I think in some ways that's easier for them to talk about. They're manipulating medical appointments and they're canceling visitation and all of this. And it's making childcare for my kid really hard. And it's making it hard for me to work, because in many ways, I think it's easier for survivors to talk about those everyday inconveniences and hardships than it is for the really traumatic things that cause them a lot of fear. It's really hard to find the words around that. How do you operate and negotiate these day-to-day things with someone who's threatened your child with a gun, someone who's, perpetrated non-fatal strangulation on you already, who's threatened to take your kids, who continuously is bringing you back to court and, wiping out all of your economic resources.
Let's talk about the family courts. As legal professionals, perhaps we don't understand. As soon as a protective parent faces an application through the family court, they become embroiled in a process that they cannot escape from. And that is a process where they have to engage, they have to file evidence, they have to produce disclosure, they have to attend court in some form or another. They probably have to give evidence at some point. They become exposed to professionals like lawyers and judges and court reporters. And I think it's easy for us to underestimate as legal professionals how uncertain the outcome can be for victims. Because in some ways, and I've seen this myself, it doesn't matter what the case starts off at. Doesn't matter if it's agreed in principle. The situation can change for survivors very, very quickly. You spoke about in one of your papers about how judges see mothers as the gatekeeper almost to the relationship between children and their father, which is highly gendered and unfair to mothers. And also, of course, we've had parental alienation and those allegations. And we know that research tells us that where alienation allegations are made against a mother, she's more likely to lose care of the child. And so when it comes to the family court system and understanding the pressures that those place on a protective parent, particularly a protective mother, I think probably you'd agree that perhaps as legal professionals, we're not recognizing that in the way that we should be.
And this is why training is so important, right? Because there's so much implicit bias and gender bias and these ideas around parenting and gender norms that sort of fuels practice in family courts. And it's really important that we interrogate those assumptions and that we have training, because lack of training creates its own biases, right? And one of the biggest issues that survivors talk about is they kind of do all the quote unquote right things that systems tell them to leave. You're experiencing domestic violence, get a protective order, leave the relationship. And society is really geared towards helping people leave. And then all the services drop off and the narrative changes from, well, why didn't she leave to why can't she co-parent? And why is she interfering with his relationship with his kids? And well, she left, so she's safe now and the kids are safe now. And we know that that's just not true. And so that's why it's really important that bias or trope of women gatekeeping the relationship. I like to say that every parent is responsible for their own relationship with their child.
Let's talk about custody stalking. So this is a term that Vivian Elizabeth came up with. It's a well-recognized tactic of post-separation abuse, which again, perhaps as legal professionals don't really understand and we're not identifying.
Perpetrators have realized a very effective way to control loving, caring moms is by targeting their children. And so that's really what custody stalking becomes, is a way to continue to force contact and control the female survivor of domestic violence, a mother, is by targeting her children. And I think, I think courts can notice it if there's, a huge shift in caregiving patterns. Let's use the sort of stereotypical, you have a mom who's a stay-at-home caregiver, the primary caregiver, and then all of a sudden you have someone who comes and says, nope, I want sole custody. And there's been a number of researchers that have, identified that abusive fathers are more likely to make applications for sole or primary custody, even though they weren't involved. I think the other way that professionals can really notice it is they ask for custody and then they get it and then they outsource the care of their children to third parties. So they're not asking for custody because they want more meaningful involvement with their child. It's about control and keeping the children away from the person who has historically been their primary caregiver.
Yeah, and we see that with contact as well. They push and push for more and more contact. Then when they get it, they're actually not there, or the grandparents are looking after the children, or an aunt or an uncle or something. So it's
hired babysitters, new girlfriend, all of that. Yes.
So we've talked about the motivation of the controlling person in terms of the control, because if you control the children, you control the victim survivor. But also that when they're pushing for either shared care arrangement or sole care, it's about not just the control, but it's about their status being recognized, because there's plenty of research out there about attitudes of controlling people and the attitude they have to the parenting style and qualities of the protective parent. And again, with that whole sort of entitlement, they're entitled, that they see themselves as the dominant party in the relationship. The controlling person's parenting is the best. It's unparalleled. They don't have any appreciation really of what the protective parent does. And that comes out of the language they use, doesn't it, often?
Very much. Yeah. Again, it's entitlement, image. A lot of times people use sort of those narcissistic qualities, but really it's about entitlement and image for many, many perpetrators.
Yeah. And you were saying in one of your papers about how you can identify this in terms of language. And it's that language around winning, around losing. And I know that if you look at things like text messages, sometimes if you put a search term in like if, and that's if you don't do this, then this will happen. That's how you can identify a person who's trying to exert the control.
Yeah, if you don't do, or if you do X, Y, or Z, then this is the punishment, or this is the form. And a lot of times that could be Those could be threats of legal involvement. It could be threats related to the kid. It could be threats of economic harm. If you don't do this, I'm not paying my child maintenance. And Evan Stark talks about this, but the rules, right? It's about people who use coercive control and who use post-separation abuse. They establish rules and then they enforce them with coercion and they enforce them through punishment. And the other thing that might be really helpful for professionals who are trying to identify that is that perpetrators use intimate knowledge of what really matters to survivors to target them. And so when they do these things, they're not randomly timed. You can also overlay it with significant events in the life of the people who are experiencing coercive control. And you'll see that they're timed to those. So maybe it's on an anniversary, maybe it's a birthday, maybe it's Mother's Day, maybe it's when someone is moving ahead. And I think those can oftentimes be really dangerous times. Getting a new job, a new partner, new housing, things that are creating more stability and helping the survivor have more autonomy in her own life. That's when the perpetrator really feels like they're losing control. And that's when you'll see these tactics escalate. So again, I find timelines and calendars really helpful tools to identify who's the primary aggressor, if that makes sense.
And going back to the legal system, survivors, they do try and compromise because they think that if they compromise, if they're being asked for a shared care arrangement, if they give the controlling person that, the post-separation abuse will stop. And of course, it doesn't stop. And I think you say in one of your papers about how often victims are agreeing to a 50-50 care situation because they're trading short-term safety because they think, great, that means this is going to stop and this abuse will end, for long-term and very long-term financial harm in some cases.
And again, that's where we kind of need our legal systems to really be attuned to this. This is a really common trade-off where survivors will say, I'm going to ask for the minimum or no child maintenance or child support, or I'm going to give up all these marital assets and, make an agreement that they think is best in terms of like custody and, shared parenting time. They're trading long-term financial for sort of short-term safety. I don't want to make the perpetrator angry by asking for too many of these financial resources. And the problem with our legal system is that if we're saying sort of separation and divorce, those financial settlements are typically finalized, at the time of divorce, where custody can be modified at any time. And so what a lot of survivors have described to me is that they made that trade-off in the short term only for the perpetrator to then just come back and then ask for more custody and ask for more custody. People who are using coercive control, they'll oftentimes move the goalpost. So you make an agreement and then they'll come back and they'll ask for more and they'll ask for more. So that's saying, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. It's continual. And I think when people realize it's not about the kids, it's really about forcing contact. It's about, again, physical proximity has been limited. And then people who are using violence and coercive control can use the court system to continue to legally justified avenue to stalk and force contact again and again and again. And that's where I think a lot of survivors eventually feel really hopeless because there are few ways to stop it. They have to engage with these legal systems.
They have to engage and they spend an awful lot of time and money. And of course, the emotional effect on them, which they're not then devoting to the children because they're constantly in this battle. And you're right. I've seen cases where there are repeated application after application. One set of proceedings end and there's another application made a couple of weeks later. And it's just constantly pushing and pushing and pushing. And this is again where the intimate terrorism label is really appropriate, because if perhaps more survivors realize that it doesn't matter what they give, there will be a price in that controlling person's head where they want to win, and there will be a price, whether it's I'm getting sole custody of the children, sole care of the children, or you're going to lose the house, or I'm going to ruin everything, including myself. And victims need to understand that you just cannot negotiate with these people.
Again, if we're thinking about perpetrator motives, one of it is really to force contact. And so you're in a situation then where they're trying, when contact has been limited in other ways, perpetrators will then use whatever avenue they can to continue to force contact. And so request for mediation again and again and again, request for in-person contact again and again and again. Legal systems professionals often don't interpret that as stalking. And I think I write this in one of my articles on post-separation abuse, but survivors really feel that way because it's that forced, repeated contact that they can't escape.
If we can move on to impact on children, because this is incredibly important. Since 2021 Domestic Abuse Act in England and Wales, children have been recognised as primary victims of domestic abuse in our legislation. Now, you've done a lot of work on how post-separation abuse manifests itself in health outcomes for children. So can you tell us a little bit about your findings?
So, my background as a pediatric nurse, I was really interested in how post-separation abuse sort of manifested and impacted both children's health and their healthcare access as part of my dissertation, because one of the things that I found in talking to survivors is that perpetrators, even when there were restraining orders or protective orders in place, people who use coercive control still have access to their child's healthcare, to their medical record, and they really use their legal custody and legal decision-making to withhold or impact their child's healthcare, because that causes a lot of distress, both to the child and to the mom. It's another way to cause harm. And so kind of the big takeaways from my dissertation were, one, that perpetrators are sort of using coercive tactics to impact their child's healthcare. And kids, when that's happening more often, have both greater rates of unmet health needs, for example, not being able to get access to mental health care. And they have greater rates of mental health diagnoses, depression, anxiety, functional symptoms like stomach aches, headaches. These are the kids who are showing up to the school nurse with sort of those somatic complaints.
And in terms of that withholding permission for various procedures, surgical procedures or non-surgical procedures to take place, or receiving certain medical treatment, is there always a sort of justification for that on the part of the controlling person?
Sometimes. So one of the items that came up a lot that I was really surprised about was saying, well, mom has Munchausen's, or mom is making up these symptoms. And so that was, Munchausen's, or factitious disorder by proxy, is a relatively rare psychiatric diagnosis. But it came up all the time in my interviews, and I was really surprised by it. And then I realized, that's a great example of what's called like a Darvo tactic, right? How do you sort of deny and reverse the victim and offender, from the work of Dr. Jennifer Freyd. And so what perpetrators would do is say, well, it's mom's mental health, or mom's making it up, or mom has this psychiatric diagnosis. The child doesn't really need this, even when it was for things that were relatively straightforward, diagnosed already by a physician for the child. Like, for example, a child having asthma and needing an asthma inhaler.
So to summarize the health outcomes or impacts on children, first of all, we have the increase of lethality rates from post-separation abuse, which generally we're not recognizing as professionals. And then we have the refusal to allow access to certain medical care, the denial of certain diagnoses because it's mother who's being neurotic, or Munchausen's by proxy, or whatever it may be. We've got the somatic issues, the stomach aches, the headaches. I suppose you perhaps could describe it as low level, but it's demonstrating the children are in distress and are being affected.
Children hold it in their bodies, right? So those somatic complaints, getting stomach aches, they don't really know how to process it. And so they hold stress, and it's going to show up in repeated headaches, repeated stomach aches.
I know that in terms of psychological impact for victims, survivors, it's PTSD, elevated rates of depression and anxiety. What about for children?
There's a whole body of research around the impacts of domestic violence on children's mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, learning disabilities. We know that there's a strong relationship there. Nobody had really tried to sort of narrow down the impact of post-separation abuse in particular, which I tried to do in my dissertation. What I was trying to do is show that children themselves are victimized and it impacts it. And when we think about domestic violence, coercive control, adverse childhood experiences, and how it impacts child's health, the primary mechanism is really through fear, right? Fear triggers the body's stress response, and children are just stuck in this on situation where they're really fearful in their environment that should be safe for them. And that sort of triggered state of being stuck on in fight or flight for a prolonged period of time, that fear is really caustic to children's neurobehavioral, neurodevelopmental outcomes.
One of the things in your research that really interested me was that children will choose connection over dangerousness. So when you're talking about fear and fear of the controlling parent, we might as professionals expect to be able to observe that and to see it, and that the child may not want to have the contact with the controlling parent. But is it the case that in fact the reverse can be true because the child is trying to have that connection?
Absolutely. And I think Emma Katz does a really good job of articulating this. Perpetrators, if they're sort of terrible to the child all the time, it's much easier for a child to sort of cut ties and say, okay. But most perpetrators aren't like that. They sort of intermix the sort of showered attention and the love bombing. It's the same cycle that's used with adults. And it's really hard for children to navigate that and to understand it. It's hard for adult survivors to understand it, right? That's why it takes so long for many survivors to leave. And for kids, you have to remember that children are wired for connection. And they're really dependent on the adult caregivers in their life for all of their basic needs. And so they are going to choose that connection. Children have a really difficult time understanding danger, right? They might feel fear, but they might have a hard time articulating why that is, or not feeling safe with someone who loves them. And I think that's really important for professionals to recognize also.
Now, a couple of things, a manifesto for change. So what are the top 3 things that you would like to see change in the legal system?
One, I think having specialized domestic violence and family violence courts that can really address the families, all their needs across systems. Just limiting the sort of systems entanglement and navigating multiple systems, I think causes a lot of harm and causes a lot of kids to fall through the cracks because every system thinks another system is addressing child safety when really none of them are. And so I think having a holistic approach would be really helpful. And in those specialized court systems, you would have professionals who were really trained on these dynamics and who could address a family's needs holistically and who can assess economic abuse, right? Economic stability is fundamental to physical safety. And so you have people who are trained on coercive control and intimate terrorism who understand how to recognize this and can hold perpetrators accountable also. But first and foremost, are really child safety has to be foremost. And in the United States, we're starting to see some jurisdictions sort of change the definition of the best interest factors. So for example, Pennsylvania in 2024, they passed Cadence law, which revised the best interest factors and now requires judges to give substantial weighted consideration to child safety. And I think changing that is really important. That has to be the foremost priority. So I don't know if I gave you 3: specialized court systems, training, and child safety is paramount.
Is there anything that you want to add that we haven't covered?
I think the big takeaway for me is that I would like professionals really to have training on these topics and to look beyond bruises, beyond the physical violence, and really understand how coercion manifests across all these different domains and that it is harming children. This is not a problem between 2 adults who just can't get along. It's one person using entitlement. They're entitled to make all the decisions for the family system, and they're entitled to punish and coerce everyone to sort of meet their needs rather than what the children, what the survivor, what they need. I think the other thing that's important to recognize is how it also becomes like an exploitation of resources. One person is really taking all of the opportunity and the economics of the family system for their own benefit, and it's harming the children and it's harming the non-offending parent. And professionals really need to be able to tease out those dynamics and not just say it's mutual abuse, right? Like I said earlier, if there's abuse, one person has the power and one person does not.
There's also the issue about the entrapment of victims and how victims feel utterly let down by systems, by institutions, because, for instance, where there's a protective order in their favour and then that's not enforced on breach. or where somebody has a court order in relation to children, which is being breached consistently. And again, there's no apparent penalty for that. And this is part of the difficulty with coercive control is a lot of the time, it's not meeting a criminal standard of a criminal offence. And it therefore goes unpunished. Like, there's no accountability. And that's what's so disheartening and deeply unfair for victims.
You talk about the institutional betrayal, right? So it's not just the abuse from the perpetrator. It's the abuse that they're receiving or that they're perceiving it as abuse. And it is, because it's also causing them harm from systems that are supposed to protect that aren't. I don't think we have really good insight into just how harmful judicial betrayal and institutional betrayal is to health outcomes. And again, it really is that being despondent, being utterly and totally trapped and feeling despair. There is no way out of this awful situation where I'm being terrorized. And I think that's where survivors lose hope. But I also think that's why it's so important for change in systems, because I think people can wrap their heads around there's one evil person who's causing harm. It's much more difficult. There's this whole system that's set up to support them to cause harm. But we can have systems change, and we can make sure that our systems are not complicit in abuse. And that's where the real work needs to be done.
So thank you very much, Dr. Kathryn Spearman. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot from you, and particularly about the health impacts for children, because I think that's something that we really ought to be talking more about. If you are a new listener, please check out our other podcasts. So far this series, we have discussed how stalkers are using the civil courts to pursue victims, how family courts deal with allegations of domestic abuse in private law proceedings, and how the financial remedy courts treat domestic abuse as conduct or not. Please follow our podcast and also give us some feedback. What topics would you like to be discussed in the future? And thank you very much for listening.